Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics Football. It's Fran here, and I'm back with a kind of Game Week 12 wildcard selection. Now, the most interesting for me was actually to kind of look at the wildcard with a bit more of a retrospective approach and actually look at over the course of the season so far who has been the best player in terms of points per match, and also not only points per match but points per match kind of per pound. And when we actually look into these metrics, we'll actually see very briefly that a lot of these players are all defenders and midfielders and keepers. Ramsdale being the key exception there. So I actually think that when we talk about a wild card, I think Ramsdale is still 100% a lock for me. Yes, he's obviously played less games. The sample size is smaller, but I think Arsenal has looked much improved with him, and also Gabriel coming back into the team, which is exactly why we see someone like Gabriel ranking quite highly on this list. When we actually go down this list, it's so hard to actually see a forward. The first person we actually see as a forward is going to be Antonio, or actually Huang rather, but you'll see how far down he ranks. And it actually shows us the season. As we pretty much know, forwards haven't been great at all. So for me, I actually think that from the wildcard approach, it actually is best to start off with the defenders and actually kind of look at them specifically. So with defenders so far, we've seen that players like Chilwell and James have vastly outperformed, and also that's due to the fact that I think the fixtures for Chelsea have been rather nice. They have, yes, of course, already played Liverpool and City, but they have just come off a fantastic fixture run, and we've also just simply seen that I think Tuchel has improvised and pretty much used their fullbacks to the best of their capacity, and also use them as midfielders effectively in the system. So whilst most of the kind of midfielders in Chelsea's system, like traditional midfielders, are kind of metronomic players, and maybe Kovacic is someone who actually has done exceedingly well, I think, in the attacking phase this season. We really do kind of see the width being provided by wingers who are basically the Chelsea fullbacks, and for the most part, we're looking at James and Chilwell. I've taken out Alonso and Azpilicueta just because I think Chilwell and James have pretty much taken and locked down these positions. I actually expect, for example, Azpilicueta to come in more often than not as a right centre back this season, as long as Reece James can be fit and playing right wing back, because he contributes just a little bit more on the attacking phase. So from the outset here, I think the first decision that wildcarders have to make is, of course, the decision between Chilwell and James. And of course, if we're chasing points from the previous week, James is, of course, that kind of best defender. But I think there's a good enough argument to say that Chilwell does make sense. I think spatially, when you look at heat maps, Chilwell does actually seem to occupy more attacking phases often. But James's underlying stats, I think, are actually slightly better from a kind of FPL perspective, where he does take a lot more shots, in my opinion, on a per game basis than Chilwell, and also sends in quite a few crosses right now that actually are very, very deadly. Tsimikas actually ranks here, and the reason why I've included him in this list and not filtered him out as a rotatable player is because of the fact that Robertson has been injured. So he's kind of conditional, where I would say, of course, with Tsimikas, you have to kind of watch exactly what's going on with the Robertson situation and kind of pay attention to that and make sure that when you're wild carding, you get the best up to date news with any kind of Klopp press conferences, right? So if we, for example, wanted to stick with the structure where Tsimikas is playing, perhaps you can actually change him for someone like Johnson from West Ham, who actually does extremely well. I've kept Johnson in this territory as an unsure player, even though his points per match per pound metric is exceedingly good. And I think, fits within that kind of team structure. If you want to be playing with, let's say, two cheaper defenders, let's say a 4.5 defender who could probably be Livramento. As we can see, of course, Livramento and White are actually pretty much neck and neck as of right now, right? If you don't have Livramento in your team, it shows you how much value Livramento still has. From that kind of metric. Of course, a lot of us capitalized on Livramento in the past, but this is a retrospective approach based on current prices, which is why you can see Livramento and White pretty much neck and neck. But I think also the fact that you're going for Ramsdale in your wild card probably means that Livramento will find his place in your team. And the fact that he outranks Duffy is a very good look, and I think a good reason to pick Livramento. Then, of course, the other locks are easily going to be Cancelo and Alexander-Arnold. I think there's not much argument really there. I think when you compare Cancelo, there's no one else in the City team who kind of provides you this sort of value at that kind of price. And the fact that he's been playing all the games this season, with the added benefit of so many kind of fullbacks not actually being able to play with the Zinchenko injury, and of course what happened to Mendy, means that Cancelo is 100% a lock. Hey guys, I'm going to stop the video right here just for a sec to actually shout out OneFootball. OneFootball is a fantastic football app that you can actually use as a football fan to make sure you track all the leagues around the world. 160 plus leagues are covered, including all the big leagues such as the Premier League. If you're a fantasy Premier League player, you'll be able to kind of follow all the kind of match day previews, have a look at detailed stats for specific games, and kind of track all the press conference news and injury kind of news around the world. At this international break, of course, you'll be able to kind of track, who's injured, who's ready to play, who's played already, and who might have been, exceptional during the international break. Not only that, but you can also make sure that you can stay up to date with games on a live basis. During the Premier League, when you're actually maybe skipping on games, you can actually track the kind of match updates and, maybe have a look at the match ticker and also kind of updated stats that are live for games. So please check it out in the link in the description below. With Alexander-Arnold, I think the interesting thing for me is the fact that the comparison now is actually between probably him and Jota, right? Or Jota, sorry, because Jota is someone who at the 7.5 price is interesting for people who will see him as a lock for a few weeks, especially due to the impact of the Mane injury, the Firmino injury, and then what will happen as well when the AFCON fixtures roll around. Now, of course, there's a lot of game weeks before that, but I imagine Jota will be a fantastic option during this kind of point and in time in this period. I still think Trent is definitely better. He's more nailed on the team, and I think just from a kind of offensive point of view, we've seen in the recent weeks why Trent is practically undroppable. The fact that you have these defenders in the league who are producing so much in the attacking phase and also able to get these clean sheet points just means that they hold much more value. Jota at best, is going to get 1 point for the clean sheet in the midfield, so the comparison is actually quite poor. I also think Trent has actually gotten a little bit unlucky as well. He's taken so many kind of set pieces so far this season, and Liverpool actually haven't scored too much from set pieces, despite actually having quite a large team in Fabinho, in Van Dijk, Konate, and Matip. But we'll see actually what happens over the course of the season. I imagine those metrics for him will actually improve, and he will get more assists out of open play. If we actually move into the midfielders, though, I would actually say that we have basically a situation where, once again, the enablers make a lot of sense. And if you've been looking at the kind of pairing of the fixtures between Gallagher and Smith Rowe, there's a good argument to say that going for these two players makes a lot of sense. I actually have added Cornet in because, yes, he's played relatively smaller minutes, but you can still see that his points per match metrics are fantastic, especially since he found his way into the side for Burnley. And he's exceedingly kind of been pushed up higher into the field, playing now almost as a striker as part of the 4-4-2 system. And for me also has basically shown to be an extremely explosive player. I think actually a little bit more explosive than Smith Rowe in that he kind of runs into more positions a little bit more often. I don't think Arsenal are actually building too many chances, nor are Burnley for that fact, but I think the fact that Burnley are trying to play around Cornet's kind of assets in terms of his ability to run in behind defenders and actually be that kind of out of position forward is interesting, where Smith Rowe has pretty much capitalized on, being correct in a sense with his kind of late runs into the box and being as clinical as possible. Cornet for me is that kind of explosive differential where, especially due to the fact that his selection percentage is so low, we're talking 1% here compared to someone like Smith Rowe, means that he's going to be a fantastic asset. So when we actually look at, for example, other kind of midfielders, Salah is obviously easy a lock, and you can see the fact that he's actually performing so well in terms of this metric shows that he clearly is the best premium in the game, regardless of the fact that he's now at a 13.0 price. Now, Rafinha is someone who's heading into kind of dangerous territory in terms of fixtures in the near future, but I actually think he could still arguably be a lock in your team. Probably doesn't really make sense to hold him right now. If you have a wild card, I would probably prioritize in getting someone like Foden in. If you didn't want to go for Tsimikas in your team, then it probably actually makes sense to go for someone like Jota, who has the kind of fixtures in hand. Some other differentials that I've included are players like Fornals and Trossard, or even Bernardo and Zaha, but for me, the fact that Gallagher exists kind of discounts Zaha a little bit, but Bernardo could be an interesting differential to Foden. He's much cheaper than Foden, and I think the metrics are pretty much bang on even, and the fact that you can maybe get a cost cutting from Foden right into Bernardo could mean that he could be an extremely successful wildcard pick. Not only that, but his selection percentage is also lower, which means that he will be quite interesting, I think, for most owners. In terms of Son, I've included him here because I think, with the forwards being so poor this season, the fact that Son still ranks relatively decently amongst most players means that I think he is probably the best second premium at this point in time. If we just look at, plain points. But of course, there might be a point in the season where you actually want to look at captaincies, and I think a lot of people still favor, players like Kane or players like Ronaldo to be differential captains to Salah further down the line. And of course, it's a little bit easier to move away from Son at that point in time if you or to move into these forwards if you already start with a forward. My general opinion, though, is that if you have a strong wild card, which at this point you probably will because you'll be extremely informed, and you'll be doing this obviously after the international break news, so you won't be kind of, dealt with hopefully any injuries, unless you're very unfortunate in subsequent weeks. I think you have the ability to probably eventually roll a transfer and move that to Ronaldo, whereas Son could probably pair Kane off quite well and give you a lot of budget to kind of spread around the team. In my opinion as well, I think, a case will have to be made for managers to actually think about, playing actually a 5 midfield stack, because right now, right, the 3-4-3 formation seems to be the general preferred formation, but I think the way that you can wildcard now means that you can probably actually go for a double enabler midfield and probably actually go for 2 starting strikers with one of the bench strikers being complete fodder. And you can kind of look to reproduce or kind of improve the kind of money in your team. You could even go for a 4 at the back formation, right? A consistent 4 at the back where you actually go for kind of 4 elite premiums. Maybe if you actually like James and Chilwell so much, and you like the double Chelsea pairing, then you can continue with those players, right? Because we don't see any other fullbacks, maybe with the exception to Tsimikas, who can actually produce as highly as some of the kind of premiums as we've seen so far. So that kind of is the way I see things for the midfielders. I've discounted most of the Everton midfielders, players like Benrahma, who I think definitely from the eye test has been a little bit off form. Looked good in the Liverpool game and also has looked good in some European Conference games, but I think still the time is to move away from Benrahma. I think there are better options at better prices. Other than that, I think, of course, we're looking at some Chelsea differentials here, but they don't make too much sense. When we're looking at forwards, though, as I say, because of the fact that your wild card will be filled in with so many players who are kind of elite defenders and elite midfielders, arguably, that you can rotate between with maybe a 5 midfield pairing, and arguably the possibility to play 5 defenders every week. We're only really interested in getting maybe 2 strikers at best. And of course, if you actually go for the Tsimikas option, I do actually expect that you could probably afford 3 strikers still. And we can still see on a points per match per pound metric that Hwang is vastly superior to most strikers. Of course, he had the benefit of not playing the early Wolves fixtures, and Antonio is someone who is now about to kind of head into it, head knee deep into some very tough fixtures. Wilson is someone who, in my opinion, actually is a very, very good differential because his ownership percentage is extremely low. And not only that, he is basically heading into fantastic fixtures in the near future. And I think if you look at the Newcastle fixtures, if you have some hope, for example, in Eddie Howe's ability to actually bring the side together, and his previous kind of experience in terms of coaching Wilson and producing a lot of great efforts with Wilson, then maybe there is I think a genuine reason to say that dropping Antonio makes sense if you can bolster your midfield, bolster your defense, and actually go for Wilson on the other hand, who's actually now at a very, very good price in my opinion. Armstrong is someone who also sits around the kind of Hwang price, and it still looks very interesting, right? Because he's gotten 2 starts back to back due to the Broya injury, and maybe if Hassan Hutel takes the form as a factor, he could fit in your wildcard team, or also just sit in your bench as an enabler, right? We have the ability, as we've seen so far, to actually play bench boosts early on in the season. I wouldn't really advise it, to be honest, but that's pretty much where we stand. But that's how I kind of rate most of the strikers, because the issue, I think, in my opinion, with a lot of the forwards is, I put Jesus and Vardy Ronaldo in this kind of unsure territory, even though they're obviously clear premiums that could be interesting. It's just the fact that, forwards have just been really, really poor in terms of value for money this season. And I think, your team should reflect that if you're going for a wild card, because you have enough information to know that it's probably a mistake to actually go deep into the forwards and have like a 3-4-3 formation. But that's pretty much how I see things in terms of the wild card. But when we actually go to my wildcard team, I actually think that, I think there's definitely an ability to go for Tsimikas. And of course, that means dropping Jota, right? I think that's the kind of big dilemma if you have a wildcard chip. And Jota seems like a very fantastic option at 7.5. The thing for me, though, is I think Tsimikas probably actually holds just a bit more value, and you can probably actually strengthen the rest of your team. Now, one of the issues I think with maybe going for a Tsimikas trust is actually the fact that you might have too much money to spend, and it's really hard to actually decide how to spend that money, because we've already explained that a lot of the forwards haven't been interesting so far. The second premium that makes the most sense right now is probably going to be Son. And, as a 10-point X midfielder, he's not actually that pricey, right? So you have the full on ability to actually go for maybe 4 enablers in your team, and that's just a bit too much. Arguably, if every week we're going to play something like a 4-5-1 formation or play like a 3-5-2 formation, we just really want to have one spare striker. We also want to have the full gambit of the midfield. So definitely, I think the Gallagher and Smith Rowe kind of team up makes a lot of sense. Tsimikas and Livramento, I think, is quite nice because, even if Tsimikas drops off later in the season, he's probably going to be a transfer that you worry about much later in the future. You'll probably have capitalized on Tsimikas for a bit and, had him as a differential for a while. Whereas if you go for a Jota draft, I think that sets you up maybe a little bit nicer in the sense that he might not actually have to be transferred in the future. That's the kind of weighing up, I think. So you have to kind of track the Robertson injury and actually make a decision there. I think if you go for the Simcast draft, you can actually go for full enablers and actually opt for this kind of wildcard team selection that I have here. The key of this draft, of course, is playing around players like Hwang and Armstrong and actually capitalizing on Wilson's fixtures. The one drop off, I suppose, is the fact that you might drop Antonio. Arguably, you can still go for Antonio and maybe just drop one of the kind of strikers that I've suggested. Maybe drop someone like Hwang or maybe drop someone like Armstrong in place of Antonio if you actually prefer him over Wilson. I still think Wilson is a fantastic differential over this period, though. And it's probably going to be quite a nice kind of homecoming period for Eddie Howe and his kind of favorite men in terms of Wilson and Frazier. When we actually look at Jota, though, and a Jota-based draft, I think you have probably the ability to play a much more default formation. You're probably going to be stuck with the fact that you want to play Antonio, I would say, as well, and make a draft that's probably a little bit more catered towards that kind of 3-4-3 structure. Because I think with Jota in the draft, you probably still want to actually have Son as your second premium in this team. You still have the money to go for Son for sure, and you can capitalize on Jota's kind of attacking fixtures for now. And maybe also doubling up on the Liverpool team doesn't make too much sense if you actually think that defensively they've been a little bit frail, but I think they're still quite good. This draft also kind of incorporates, the ability to play with both Wilson and Antonio, and then having just a pure kind of bench option as well in the team. But let me know what you guys think about the wild card. I think there's been a lot of kind of decisions to make as a wild card holder if you've actually gone this far, to be honest, because you probably don't have the same kind of team value as most teams, but you have the opportunity to really completely forego a lot of these forwards who've been holding a lot of price for no real reason in people's teams, right? Forwards have been extremely inefficient so far, and I think the wise move, if you've lasted with your wildcard chip this long, is to actually hold it and make sure you actually switch your team adequately into these defenders, into these midfielders who've done so well in the season so far.